I'm so excited to be. Okay, the meeting's being recorded. Thank you for all for coming, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you and tell you a little bit about the book and the sort of the impetus for writing it and all that kind of stuff. I would like to say, though, that I am a conversation person. The pandemic has been really hard for me because I'm a people person. I like to be out and about and visiting and having conversations. So I really would encourage you to please ask questions. You don't have to wait till the end. If you have a question, please just, let me know. You can just like wave at me or something and I'll stop talking so that you can ask. And so the plan for me, at least kind of what I would like to do today, is to tell you a little bit about how the book got, how the book sort of originated, and then I'll do a little bit of a reading of a couple of pages so you can get a sense of what it's like and what my writing is like. And then, I'd love to just really have a conversation about family, which is really what this book is about. So when I was in my 40s and my mom was in her early 60s, my mother and father had four of us. I'm the oldest of four siblings, and my mom and dad had kids. They got married and had kids very early. They were already with four children by the time my mother was 26 years old. And so my parents, as parents and grandparents, were on the young side. When I got to be, when I was in my early 40s, my parents were in their early 60s. So it was, they were fairly young in their lives still. And in the early 60s, in my mother's early 60s, she started exhibiting some early signs of memory loss. And we became increasingly concerned because the memory loss seemed to be growing. And she would first start with repeating stories, and then she would lose track of entire events that had happened, and then it just kind of snowballed from there. And then a few years later, when my father was in his early 70s, he was diagnosed with ALS, with Lou Gehrig's disease. And he died suddenly. He died about a year after, well, actually, it was just a month or two after his official diagnosis, but it was a year after he started showing signs. And when that happened, and it happened very suddenly, he had a sort of a massive heart attack, and it was very catastrophic for my mom. And then my mom's dementia really sort of exploded, and it became very clear that what had been happening was that my father was covering for her for many, many years, that she had been getting increasingly more demented as she sort of behind the scenes. And so my dad was sort of managing for both of them. And so during that period of time, and I was, the oldest, and I was my mother's daughter in many ways. If you look at the picture behind me, the picture that's on the cover of the book, you can see I look a lot like my mom. And I started sort of struggling with the idea that my mother was disappearing in front of my eyes. And I have two children myself. And so I decided that what I wanted to do was try to write a book about my mom so that my kids would not forget her, so that I could keep her here even as she began to disappear. And so that was sort of the impetus for writing the book. And of course, as my mother sort of got more and more sick, it became more and more difficult to really figure out how I could write about something that was sort of in progress. And I tried many times. I started and I stopped, and it became this sort of really frustrating experience because I couldn't figure out how to get down on paper what I wanted to get down. I couldn't figure out how to keep her in the way I wanted to keep her. And so it wasn't really until after she died, about a year after she died, where I was talking to a friend, and I was still very emotional about my mother's passing. And I said to her, my friend, I said, I really want to write this book and I don't know how to do it. And I've tried all these times and it doesn't seem to want to work. It can't come out. And she referred me to a friend who was a content editor. So she ended up being my writing coach, and she helped me with the process. And so basically, that was the beginning. So I started the book my mom died in January of 2016. I started the book in January of 2017, and I was finished by May of 2018. So it took me about 18 months to get the book to a place where I wanted it to be. And then I found a publisher. It's published by a small press in New York City called Adelaide Books. They published the book, and it came out in December of 2019. So in book life, that's pretty quick. It didn't seem quick to me, but the reality is that getting a book out into the world takes a long time. And so that was kind of the birth of this story. It's not surprising that the book that I ended up writing was very different than the book I thought I was going to write. I thought I was going to write a book about my mother. I ended up writing a book about myself. And it ended up being really an exploration of my relationship with my mom and with our family, both through her Alzheimer's and also looking back in sort of a retrospective, because everybody knows that family relationships are complicated. And so my relationship with my mother and my family was extraordinarily complicated as well. But in the end, I kind of consider this to be sort of my love letter to my mom and to our relationship, a way of honoring that relationship with her. I think what I'm going to do just to start is I'm going to read a little bit of a chapter. I typically read the beginning, but I think just because we're in the middle of baseball playoffs and I'm a baseball fan, I think what I'll do is I'll just read a couple pages from chapter 6, which is called The Bottom of the Ninth. And it's about my family's connection to baseball and also the use of baseball as a metaphor for relationships with families. When I grew up, I grew up a New York Mets fan. We went to Shea Stadium. That was our big treat. When we were kids, my mom would load us all in the station wagon. We had an old Country Squire wood paneled station wagon, and we would drive into New York and go to Shea. And so my memories of baseball and my love of baseball was really rooted in that experience. And so this takes place in one of those moments. I hardly remember a time when baseball wasn't a part of my life. I was 8 years old the first time I went to Shea Stadium, and the memories of that evening were as fresh as if it were yesterday. Hey, hot dogs here, get your hot dogs here. The lean, dark-skinned vendor rested the big steel hot box up on his shoulder as he climbed up and down the aisles. Hey, hot dogs here, he sang, adding another syllable to the word the way the New Yorkers often did. It is a warm summer night in June. The crescent moon hangs low in the night sky. Shea Stadium seems enormous. The smell of hot dogs punctuates the thick air, and the light stands buzz, washing the outfield in a golden glow. My grandfather unbuttons his suit coat and hangs it over the back of his seat. My brother Michael and I watch the players warm up on the field. It is 1968, the year before the New York Mets won it all. We are the lucky ones. While the others had to stay home with our mother, We are the ones who were chosen to come tonight. We'll take 4, my father said, holding up his fingers just to be sure. My father, grandfather, brother Michael, and I sat along the first base line in the blue box seats that my grandfather got from his employer, John H. Free. Although he had been a sports writer early in his career, by the time I knew him, my grandfather was making a living selling paper goods. The box seats were used to entertain potential customers. There were very few sports my grandfather didn't like. As a writer, he'd covered track and field events, cross-country races, and soccer matches. He loved the horse races and frequently went to the track. On the night his only son was born, my grandfather was covering a boxing match in Madison Square Garden. It was a story my uncle loved to tell about how his birth was announced to a crowd of thousands. Mr. Basili, the PA announcer said to the packed house, "You have a son." For the moment I stepped into the stadium, I was mesmerized. "Keep your eye on A.G.," my grandfather said, pointing to the center fielder. He'd been one of the Mets' hottest hitters, but early in the season, he'd been hit in the head by a pitch. Now he was really struggling. I watched my grandfather keep score. I listened intently as he talked to my father. "He's a bum," he'd yell when Jerry Grody struck out. "Come on," he'd call out, tossing his scorecard to the ground when Ed Kranepool missed the tag at first. I loved the way the players' names sounded when he said them in his thick Italian accent, the way he threw his hands up in the air when we left runners on base. My grandfather didn't just watch the game, he participated in it. He sat on the edge of his seat, his sharpened pencil poised on his scorecard. He was all in. Every pitch, every swing, every out. When my mother was born, he found an ally. My grandmother didn't care much for sports, and so it was my mother who he took with him to the bleachers at Ebbets Field on Saturday afternoons. New York had always had more than one baseball team, the Yankees in the American League and the Giants and Dodgers in the National League. The Giants played uptown at the Polo Grounds. My mother's family lived in Brooklyn, not too far from Ebbets Field. They rooted for the Dodgers. My mother and grandfather read the box score together every morning. She loved Roy Campanella, Pee Wee Reese, and Gil Hodges. She'd go to bed at night with the window open just so she could hear the PA announcer's voice as she drifted off to sleep. "Reese to Robinson to Hodges," she'd say, repeating the double play call of her childhood team. My mother would often share stories about the good old days when the players lived in the neighborhood and would occasionally be spotted playing stickball in the streets with the local kids, or how sometimes the players' wives would come home with a carload of groceries and the kids would fight to help them bring them inside. She said she cried when the Dodgers left Brooklyn in 1957. She had a way of making growing up in Brooklyn seem like an old sepia photograph, all romantic and smoky. I never questioned if her stories were true. They were soft and warm and fuzzy. As I got older, I found myself caught up in her nostalgia, wishing I could step back in time when life, as she portrayed it, seemed so much simpler. It would be a few years before a new team would come to New York. When the Mets began playing at Shea in 1962, she adopted them as her own. As I grew up, my mother still read the box scores in the paper every morning. Over poached eggs and toast, she taught me about the game. We talked about the hit and run and questioned whether Gil Hodges, the Mets manager, should have let Tom Seaver, his star pitcher, hit for himself in the bottom of the eighth. Baseball for us was a talking sport. And even more importantly, as I grew older, it was the one subject where we could safely approach each other. When we were kids, we would go to Shea Stadium a couple of times each season. We'd pile in the Country Squire station wagon and drive over the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, the one that linked Staten Island to Brooklyn. As we drove across the island, through Brooklyn to Queens, the excitement would build. I'd look for the familiar blue and orange stadium in Flushing Meadows and listen for the sound of jets taking off from nearby LaGuardia Airport as we flew high above us. We'd bring our own dinner, stopping at the local hoagie hut to get several long submarine sandwiches to share. There was always meatball and one stuffed with Italian meats, and my mother's favorite, tuna. But those were special occasions. Most of the time, we watched the games on the television or listened to Ralph Kiner, the Mets announcer, call the game on the radio, even if it was during dinner. It was the one exception my mother made to her no TV at dinner rule. That, and of course, New Year's Day, when my father rolled the TV stand into the living room and we ate buffet style so we could watch the bowl games. Like her father, my mother always kept score, often penciling in a handmade scorecard on the back of an envelope or on little slips of paper that I'd later find on the coffee table or tucked as a placeholder into whatever book she was currently reading. Like her father, she too was a heckler. Baseball was in my blood. I followed my mother's lead. The Mets were our team and we wore our loyalty on our sleeves. I hung a blue and orange Mets banner on my bedroom wall. Like my mother, I too had my favorites, Tommy Agee and Cleon Jones, Tom Seaver and Tug McGraw. When the Mets lost, we were broken. When they won, as my mother used to say, all was right with the world. You know, when I was a kid, she'd say, to ease the sting of yet another losing season, and with the Mets, there were plenty of them, wait till next year. And then she'd look over at my father and smile, crossing her arms the way she did to add an exclamation point before we would inevitably launch into a story about her beloved Brooklyn Dodgers. So that's a little bit from that chapter.
Nice.
Thank you. So it's interesting, you know, the book itself it starts with my mother's death. It begins in the last moments of her life. She was living in a nursing home at the time, and it kind of works backwards. From there, I talk about my childhood quite a bit. I was very fortunate. I grew up in Somerset County, New Jersey. We spent a lot of time going into the city. My parents were, they really believed that we should be exposed to a lot of things. So we went to the theater and we went to the opera, and we, you know, took vacations. And she took us when we were kids several times to Europe. So there's chapters about going to Europe in there. I also was very fortunate that I am the daughter of a granddaughter of an Italian immigrant. So there is a big section of the book that speaks to my connection to my Italian roots. And I'm very proud to have received my Italian citizenship just a few years ago in a way of honoring my grandfather and my mother. But it's a bunch of stories, really. It's a book really about the connection of family, the love of family, the challenges that we go through as family members. You know, family relationships are tricky. As I mentioned before, I loved my mother dearly, and we struggled to find common ground. And so I tell that story in the book. And yeah, so I mean, I think that's an introduction. I'm certainly, what I'd prefer to do, if it's okay with you, is I'd love to have a conversation. I'm certainly happy to answer questions about the book, but I'd love to have a conversation about family, because I think really for me, that's really been the anchor in my life. I have my own family. I'm married and have two adult young men, boys. They're my babies, but they're both adults at this point. Both my parents are deceased now, but I still am very close with my two brothers and my sister, and my extended family. So family has always been, I think in large part, you know, I've always sort of understood it in large parts because I was raised in an Italian family where family is the most important thing. But I'm happy to talk about family and about mother-daughter relationships, which you know, I have a little bit of experience with. So I don't know if anybody have anything particular they'd like to hear, or any questions you'd like to ask me to start the conversation today?
Well, I was really interested when I read your book about your relationship with your mother, and you know, we had become friends, and I'd heard, you know, lots of stories of your life, but I never heard excuse me, I never heard from you about the problems you have with your mother. And so I was expecting something else when I was reading the book. Just like you said, I was expecting more about the Alzheimer's and more about how difficult that would be.
Mm-hmm.
And I really responded more to the problems you have with your mother, because I didn't have that. Was she seemed to be jealous of you? Was that what it was?
You know, I don't know. It's interesting because when you look at something, you know, you're looking from hindsight, and I don't know if that were true or not. I know that my mom was a very proud woman, and my mom was a very gifted woman, and she had a really difficult time sharing the spotlight. And so that was a little tricky, you know, because when you have children, and you have my father was a politician. My father was a high profile politician growing up, and so she was faced with that challenge quite a bit, and I think there were times she did better, and there were times that she didn't do as well with sharing the spotlight. And I think it was easier to share the spotlight with my dad, because I think she was extraordinarily proud of him, and she saw herself as a partner in his success. And I think it was a little trickier with her kids. So I wish I knew. I mean, it was not something we could ever talk about. Valerie, it looked like you had a question you wanted to ask, or a comment. Oh, you have to unmute yourself. There you go.
I just loved your comments about the Mets because as a child, I grew up on Long Island, and I was an only child, and my dad and I went to Yankee Stadium. But then when I was married and living in New Jersey, it became a lot easier to drive to Shea than to go to Yankee Stadium. So yes. I sort of became a Mets fan, and some of my fondest memories is of going to games with my father and my two sons. And that was something we did, several times a summer. And that was like you were talking, it was a special outing, definitely special. Then I wanted to tell you about one time Ed Kranepool came to Chester, and he stood in front of what was then Channel Lumber, and it's gone through several changes. It's probably now where Home Goods is. And he greeted fans, and he signed autographs, and I took my two sons, and they were so excited. I think my older son, who's now 54 and is a great saver of memorabilia, he probably still has that autograph someplace.
That's awesome. That's fantastic.
So that was just fun to hear you talking about those days.
It's interesting. My mother loved baseball. My father liked baseball too, but my mother was a diehard fan. She took after her dad, and I took after my mom, because of all the siblings, I'm the baseball lunatic, right? You'll see in the book that I spent my 30th birthday I'm a Giants fan now, a San Francisco Giants fan, because I live out in the Bay Area, but I went to my 30th birthday and my 40th birthday and my 50th birthday. They're always at Candlestick Park or at AT&T Park now. And so, and every Mother's Day, I'm the mom that shows up with her glove. And every time I go, I keep score. I'm still a scorekeeper. In fact, many people don't even know how to keep score. And so when my kids played Little League, I was the one who always kept the book for the team managers, because I was the only one who knew how to do it. But it was interesting that for me, it really was my mother and I, especially when I became an adolescent, my mother and I just seemed to clash all the time. And even as I became an adult and I was still struggling with her, it literally was the one place we could always talk and find common ground. And so it really was a savior in many ways. Baseball is very special to me for that reason, that it really became the language that I could communicate with my mom about. And I have
That's interesting.
wonderful memories about Shay. Wonderful memories about Shay.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Other
And the
questions?
I've never been to a baseball game, so I can't relate to that. Well, I've been to maybe one Giants game in my lifetime. But so it's interesting to me to see how in another family, baseball could play such a huge role, and how it could even affect the relationship with your mother. And we never spoke about baseball. My grandfather would, there's Willie McCovey, or he'd say one name or something, and but that was it. I didn't mean to talk over somebody. Was someone else trying to talk?
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I was just going to add something that now as a grandmother of young gentlemen playing baseball, I go to their games, and I was at a game on Sunday, and those two boys are just immersed in baseball, and they're huge Yankee fans now because their mother's a Yankee fan. So my son still hangs on as a Mets fan, and
good for him.
He's in the minority in that family. It's kind of funny.
It is so funny because because we were Mets fan, we hated the Yankees, right? And so in San Francisco, if you're a Giants fan, you hate the Dodgers, right? So it's always about the rivalries.
Yeah.
And even the Bay Area has two teams. You're either a Giants fan or an A's fan, but I've always been a National League fan, so I don't even pay attention to the American League. So it's very interesting how that is, but my kids are big baseball fans too. Both my boys played baseball. So that's something that I share in common with my own kids. So it's really fun. Kelly, you had a comment or a question?
I'm curious about your siblings' reactions to the book, particularly your brothers.
Yeah.
You had a little bit of contention with.
Yeah, so I have two brothers and a sister. So my youngest brother, whose name is Robert, and I write about him, all my siblings in the book, obviously. He and I are, very close. I would say that I'm close with all my siblings, but relationships are different with every one of them. But my brother Robert and was one of those people that I would call up and I'd say, "Do you remember?" And so I would go back and I'd kind of think through my own memories and being able to write the book. But right before I was about to send it off to the publisher, I sent the finished version to my siblings, and they read it and were really supportive. I was really pleased with that. I did say to them, when you write a memoir, you're telling true stories, and of course it's not like a diary. I'm not airing everything. You pick and choose what stories you share to be able to forward the story. But the truth is that there is exposure that is true for them, and they had to be okay with it. And so I did say to them, if there was anything that they wanted me to take out of the book, I would do that to honor them. And they didn't. They were fine with it. So yeah, they were. I feel very lucky that they were as supportive as they were. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. What else? What
Wow.
other
What an
things can I
experience.
talk about that are interesting?
Suzanne,
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, this is Cynthia. I mean, your class, I love your class in Psychology 1. And writing the book, did you want to go back in time to process that part of your life up to the present? I don't know when your mom passed away.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Cynthia, because I'm sorry to cut you off. Was there more you wanted to say? The delay is hard with Zoom. So it is interesting. So what happened for me, which you learn very quickly in the book, is that my relationship with my mother was fraught with a lot of tension, and I loved my mom. I still love my mom very deeply. And part of what happened for me was I was always sort of struggling with why can't we get it right? Why can't we be close the way other people's moms and daughters are? I desperately wanted that. I wanted to be able to call my mom and talk to her about, you know, just about stuff, like use her as a friend, use her as a confidant. But that was not the kind of woman my mother was, and that was not the kind of relationship we had. And so a lot of times, you know, I would leave those conversations feeling judged and feeling criticized, and so over time I built up a wall between she and I, and it was really painful for me because I kept wanting this connection. I kept wanting to be close. And oddly enough, you know, that went into adulthood, and it lasted through my entire adulthood. And then she got Alzheimer's, and then she started to disappear. And so the potential for that reconciliation disappeared with the Alzheimer's. And the interesting thing is that, you know, I never stopped wanting it. Even when it was so clear it was impossible for her to offer it to me, I never stopped wanting it. And so what happened was, when she died, I was left with all this stuff, like all these feelings that I had not processed. And I thought, oh my gosh, I can't write this book about my mom without looking at my own stuff about what, and that's why I say this book was a surprise to me, because I really had to look at myself as I wrote this and try to understand her for who she was, and learn through the writing of the book that my mom was who she was, and she did the very best she could. In many ways, she was a wonderful mother. And the other reality is, she didn't give me what I wanted from her. And so I had to come to terms with that. And so the interesting thing about it, Cynthia, is that by the time I finished, all that angst, all of those feelings that I was left with were gone. And it became a therapeutic process for me that I never expected. And so I literally wrote away the pain. And now when I think of her, my heart is open. I don't have any of that kind of, you know, wall that we had between us for all those years. It was really, I consider it such a blessing. You know, it was really a gift. It was very painful. There were a lot of tears shed while writing this book. I cried a lot.
I bet you did.
I cried a lot.
I'm so glad you explained that.
Yeah.
Kind of cathartic episode by writing it.
Yeah, it was really interesting. It was really interesting. And it's interesting to think, you know, a lot of times people will say, you know,
thank you so much.
And people will say to me, you know, what do you think your mother would say? And I don't know. I don't know what my mother would say. You know, I think it would be hard for my mom. She was a very proud woman, and I think she would have a hard time. I think she would have a hard time with some of the truths, my truths that are in it. But I am pleased that the feedback that I've gotten from most people that have read it is that what comes across throughout the book is how much I loved her. And that feels good to me. I did not want it to be, in fact, I was, as I was writing, I found myself feeling very protective of her. There were a lot of times when I kind of didn't want to tell a story, or didn't want to put in sort of out what I was struggling with. And my writing coach would say to me, you know, that you have to go there. You have to speak that truth. That's part of it. And you have to look at why you're struggling to protect her so much. And so I was, you know, I'm really glad that what comes out is how much I cared about her, because that was really the truth. She was a really extraordinary woman.
That's beautiful the way you say that,
It is.
because it's almost as if you tried your best and she tried her best. And
Exactly.
you're both present,
Right.
and that's beautiful.
And I think the other thing that happens too is when you become a parent yourself, you understand, right, differently. I have, I have struggled with some of the same things my mother struggled with my own kids, and I learned that through being a parent, right? And you can't know that before you know it, right? It's like one of those things you can't learn that from a book, you can't learn that from reading. You have to learn it through going right through the middle of it. And the benefit for me, because I've spent most of my life as a social worker and as someone who studies therapy and mental health, and I've been a therapist for years, and I was a family therapist. I dedicated my career to working with families to help them heal the challenges that they had. I did have the ability to step outside myself and kind of watch my own process in a different way, because I had been trained to do that. And so I think that I benefited from that too. But it doesn't mean there weren't blind spots. There were plenty of blind spots that I had to work through when I was writing the book.
Suzanne, you also talked about how you struggled before you actually got this book going. Can
Yes.
you speak, I'm trying to write a memoir about my dad, and it's really hard to write a memoir about someone else. Like, it really
Yes.
has to be your own experience.
It
But
is.
I don't, like, everyone keeps giving me that advice. It has to be my reflections of my dad. But I'd really like to just write a book about him. But then I guess it just becomes a biography, not a book. So can you share a little bit about your early stages before you got going on the actual memoir with your support from your editor friend?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so that's such a great question, because you're right. When you write a memoir, you are the star of it. It is your story. And in the beginning, I didn't understand that, right? You are the hero of the story. You become a character in the story that you're trying to tell. And so in the beginning, what I was trying to do was focus my story on my mom, and it wasn't working because that was not my story to write. So it's very interesting when you write. I've learned a bunch of things over the years. I've taken a lot of writing courses. I've been writing my whole life. My mother was a writer. My mother wrote for a newspaper in New Jersey called the Home News, which no longer exists, but she was a columnist and wrote for many years for the Home News. And so writing definitely is in my blood. But and I've taken a bunch of classes, and for a while I was taking a seminar in memoir with a very well-known San Francisco Bay Area author whose name is Adair Lara, and she has a number of books herself, and she was helping me with the early stages of this book. And I remember her saying to me, it might not be time for you to write it yet. It's not, the story's not finished. And so I learned, and she turned out she was right. And I had to wait until my mom passed before I could write the story. That doesn't mean everyone has to wait till whoever they're writing about, passes. But I think there is a truth in understanding when the story needs to be told and when it's ready to be told. So that's one thing. And it wasn't ready for me to write it yet. I literally tried to write for 4 years before I actually found the point at which I could actually do it. And so that's one thing. And then the other thing is really trying to understand whose story is it to tell. And so if you're just writing sort of a family history and a biography about your dad or your family, that's one thing. If you're writing a memoir, you're really writing about yourself. And and you can write about the other person, but it's always from your viewpoint, from your vantage point. And so it's interesting. I recommend, having been through this process once, I'm in the middle of writing a second book now that'll be out next September by the same publisher, which is a book about walking the Camino de Santiago de Compostela in Spain. And that will be out, like I said, that book will be out in September of next year. But having been through it now once, I feel more prepared to do the second one. The first one, I really needed some guidance. And so I owe a lot to my editor, whose name is Elaine Silver. And Elaine is a career editor. She has a really storied history in the literary world. She was Dr. Ruth Westheimer's writer for a long time, for those of you that remember Dr. Ruth. But she's written for medical journals, and she's worked with other writers. And so she was extraordinarily instrumental. And so that would be one thing that I'd suggest, is to find somebody that you can write with, that can read your writing, that can give you feedback, that maybe can help guide the story for you. In terms of what she did with me, it was very interesting. We would meet, we'd have lunch or coffee, and she was kind of like my book therapist, is kind of how I referred to her. She didn't tell me what to write, but we'd talk, and then she'd say, why don't you go write about your siblings? And so then I'd go home and I'd write about my siblings. And then I would come back and I'd send her what I'd written. And then she'd say, okay, here's 6 more questions. And then I would go back into it and I would revise what I had written, and I would answer those questions. And it became this story, this experience of sort of peeling away the layers of the onion until you get to the truth on the inside. And so for me, I loved the process. I thought the process was extraordinary. In fact, I liked the process. I'm sort of a process-oriented person anyway. I sort of like the process more than I like the end product. I mean, I'm proud of the book, but I loved writing. When I was doing the Camino, I was really sad when it was over. I loved walking. I loved the process of being on that journey. I jokingly say that I love Christmas Eve more than I love Christmas, right? I like the build up. I'm a person who's sort of happy with sort of things when they're in motion, and when they're over, it's really hard for me. So this process of exploration, of unpeeling the onion, of looking deep, of even crying, having really tearful moments, was just really extraordinary for me. It really felt like a gift. Did that answer your question, Laurel?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. What else?
A very powerful book.
Thank you.
I was
Go ahead,
wondering,
Valerie.
could you explain the title, Cardinal Club, where that came from?
Yes, it's the story is in the book. It's about a game that my mother would play with us when we were kids. My father ran a chemical company, and he was a politician, and he traveled a lot for work, and so consequently he missed a lot of family dinners. And so it was my mother and the 4 of us around the dinner table often. And one night we were all sitting around the dinner table, and she took her napkin and she put it on top of her head. She folded it so that it was kind of folded diagonally so that there was a point. And she put the napkin on her head, so the point kind of came right here. And she said, okay, kids, put your napkins on your lap or on your head. And we all put our napkins on our head. And she said, welcome to the Cardinal Club. And so from that moment on, we would have these Cardinal Club meetings at dinner time when my dad wasn't home. And it was funny because it was our little secret. In fact, my father never even knew about it. We weren't allowed to tell him. And we never had meetings when my dad was home. We only had them when he was gone. And it wasn't until we were all adults, we were sitting around the table. My parents had a home on Sanibel Island in Florida. And we were sitting around the table in Sanibel Island, and we kind of spilled the beans and told my dad that we had this secret club, and we initiated him so he could be part of the club too. But he didn't get to be in it until it was you know, we weren't really having those meetings anymore. But it was just one of those moments when, you know, when my mother was playful. She was not a particularly playful lady. She was sort of always teaching us. And I just, it's just something that's always stuck with me. It's been sort of a wonderful memory. So that's where the title comes from.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about the book that you're about to publish?
I was
Yes.
just going to ask that.
Yeah. So last when we could still go outside in the world, last year, remember that? It seems like about 100 years ago. I walked the Camino de Santiago de Compostela. It's a 500-mile walk across the north of Spain, and it is a pilgrimage. It's been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's a walk from a very small town on the border of France called Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, and across to Santiago de Compostela, which is a city on the west coast of Spain, where the bones of St. James, the apostle, are supposed to have been buried. And so I did this walk. It takes, you know, about a month to walk, and you walk anywhere from 18 to 22 miles a day across, carrying everything on your back. And so I did that last year in celebration of my 60th birthday. And it was an interesting experience for me. There's a lot of books that have been written about it, just in terms of sort of as the story of walking. But for me, the book that I'm writing is really about the lessons that I've learned, through that process of walking. So the book is going to be called Estrellas, which means stars in Spanish. And the subtitle is Moments of Illumination along the Camino de Santiago. So it is really a story about, not so much about the walk itself, but about the lessons and the illuminations, the moments of learning for me. And the interesting thing about it is that it's rooted around an experience that we had in a town called Carrion de los Condes. And Carrion is about a third of the way across the Camino. And I tell this story in the book. We went to, Carrion is known for one thing, and that is that there are a bunch of nuns there that sing. So everybody that goes to Carrion wants to meet the singing nuns. And so I went to their performance, which wasn't really a performance, it was really a group sing-along. And then I went to the Pilgrim Mass at the end of the evening. And at the Pilgrim Mass, the nuns handed out a little paper star, and they handed it to us. And what they said to us was that we were to remember that each of us are light. That it is our job to be the light for someone else in the world, and that when we remember that we all are the light, that we are all stars in the sky, that we can light even the darkest night. And that really struck me. That story really stayed with me. And so the book is a story about the stars that I met along the Camino and the things that I learned from them. So it's really about other pilgrims that I met as I was walking.
I sure enjoyed hearing a lot of the stories on social media. It was really fun because I felt like a participant in it.
It was an amazing, it's really an extraordinary experience.
I guess so. I don't think I have enough energy to do that. It looks really hard.
It's hard. It's a hard thing, but it's a good thing.
Can I ask what made you decide to do the walk? And did you do it by yourself or with someone? I
did it alone. And what made me decide? That's a question I am struggling with in the book. I just felt called to do it. I had I had read Cheryl Strayed's book Wild, and I remember when I read it thinking, I want to do something like that. That's this sort of independent kind of journey, life journey kind of thing, metaphorical life journey. And I was turning 60, and I just thought, and the book was about to come out, and I was just like, you know, it's time. I just want to do it. It's just, I feel called to do it. And I just sort of said out loud to my husband, I want to walk the Camino de Santiago. And he said, have a good time. Because there was just no way he was going to walk it with me. He's not a big fan of walking crazy distances.
How long did it take you?
It took me 31 days. I had one day when I didn't walk because I had terrible blisters. I had to stop one day and rest. But yeah, I walked straight for 31 days, and it was an extraordinary experience.
That's amazing.
And it was fascinating. Let me see, there's a comment from Lisa. My husband and myself were doing that this spring, but COVID, yes, of course, Lisa, right? So many people had planned to do it, and the Camino shut down with COVID. I hope to go back and do it again next year. That's my plan.
We were going to do it the year before, but with my husband's mother's illness, we didn't want to be away that long. So we were doing it, but we shortened it. We were going to do 2 weeks on the trip, and then we were going to go down to Portugal and spend, you know, some time in Portugal. But yeah, we were doing it about the experience, about everything you're going to see, you're going to take in, reflection, stuff like that. Not so much for the religious aspect of it, but I was looking forward to going to all the cathedrals and eating in all the places along the way. But sadly, we were told, nope, you can't come this year.
Well, there's always next year or the year after. It's interesting, you know, the range of the age range of people on the Camino, from little kids who are walking with their parents to, I walked with an 84-year-old man who was a former professor at Cornell, and I walked with him for a long period of time. A good friend that I met on the way was 73 and had had double hip surgery, and he was walking. There were lots of older nuns. There was one priest I met from Philadelphia, a Franciscan priest who was walking in sandals. And it's interesting. It's one of those things where you can walk it very slowly. You don't have to walk 20 miles a day. The sisters that I met from Ireland that had walked it 3 or 4 times actually were walking, you know, 5 or 6 or 7 miles a day, and then they would rest, and then they would walk the next day because they weren't in a rush. And not everybody does the whole thing. Some people walk for a couple of weeks. Some people start in Saria, which is at the end, and you can walk the last 100 kilometers into the town of Santiago. The only disappointment that I had was by the time we got to Santiago, the cathedral was closed because they were renovating it. And so I actually did not get to see the cathedral in Santiago, which is why I have to go back when they have it, the renovations finished.
You had a big party that night though, didn't you? A really fun last night party?
No, not so much. No, it was interesting. There was I think I just had dinner with a couple of friends that night, but it was interesting. You asked why I went by myself, and part of that too, I think, was I was a lot of people go with other people. They go with their spouses, they go with their friends, they take their kids. I met this wonderful lady who was walking with her 3 children. And I would have loved to have my kids with me. That would have been really fun. But I also knew that I needed to do this particular one on my own because I needed to challenge myself socially, and I needed time to think. And I also needed it to be my Camino. I didn't want to have to think about doing it with somebody else in the sense that we had to negotiate, you know, where we were going and where we were stopping and how far, you know, I just wanted to just kind of just do it. And there were pluses and minuses to that, but I'm really glad I went by myself. But I hope you get to do it, Lisa, because it really is extraordinary, really extraordinary. And the churches are amazing. Yeah. I did not go with the intention of it being a religious pilgrimage either. It just is. That's part of it. And a lot of people walk just for the walk. And there are a lot of people that are quite religious that are walking. And my experience was a little bit of both. I didn't go with the intention of it being religious, but I think I wouldn't say it didn't turn out to be religious, but I think I understand my faith a little bit differently having done that walk. Any other?
I can't wait to read it, Suzanne.
Yeah.
I really am looking forward to it. I had to be outside, and my battery is going to go out any second. I just wanted to say thank you. I really enjoyed hearing you talk.
You're welcome. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Other thoughts or questions about the book, the Cardinal Club, or about writing, or about family?
I'm just curious because you're partway through writing this book and you've already done this long walk. I know you're going to return, but have you already started percolating about the book after that, or is that too much pressure?
No, I have. It's interesting. You know, it's one thing that has been, you know, it's the practice of writing is an interesting one. Diane, the gal up that is outside in the mountain area of Lassen, she's an artist, and so she does beautiful drawings, just really extraordinary drawings. And so you know, when I met Diane a number of years ago, we were teaching together in Spain. And my brother is a composer, and his husband is a oil artist, does these gigantic canvases. And so I have sort of always wanted, I wanted to be creative. I wanted to be a creative person. And I didn't see myself that way, even though I think I am a creative person. I have, you know, I love to cook, and I love to entertain, and I have written most of my life, but there was something about writing this book that sort of, in my way, kind of gave me what I considered to be sort of legitimacy about being creative. And what I found was that in finding that, or sort of opening that door for me, I sort of realized that I had sort of a creative process that you can't be creative if you don't create, right? You're not gonna be a great artist at the beginning. You just have to keep doing it. It becomes this practice. And so what I learned about writing was that I had to have a writing practice. I had to show up and sit down and write crappy stuff and edit it and, you know, throw it out and start again. And one of the things that I've found that helps me when I'm in that process is walking, which is really interesting. But I walk every day. I walk 4.5 miles every morning with my dogs. And that's the time when I sort of allow myself to just think about what I might write about. And if I'm stuck, if I'm struggling with some kind of writer's block, or I'm stuck with what my writing is, I'll just go and walk, and that'll kind of, ideas will percolate. And so a couple of weeks ago, I was writing, and same thing. I thought, I got to get out of here. So I took the dogs for a walk. And I realized that one of the things that happened when my mom passed away was we had to clean out her storage locker. And so I ended up with this gigantic box of stuff that she had written herself, you know, old newspaper columns and manuscripts that she had sent off to publishers that never got published, and all sorts of things that she had. And in it was a pack of letters that my father had sent her. She'd saved every single letter that my father had sent her. And so all of a sudden I realized as I was walking that that's the next book. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but there's something in those letters that is going to be the inspiration for the next book after this one.
How beautiful. Good luck with that.
That's what I was going to ask you about, Suzanne, is you also mentioned in the book that that she had journals. And I'm wondering
Yes.
if you were able to gain any insights from reading through those, insights into your mother.
No, so it was interesting. It is my mother's journals were very much sort of documentation, not so much about her internal process. And so the journals are, for me, they were touchstones in a way about the travels we had taken, and they were sort of like jumping off points for me to remember certain things, but it wasn't like they illuminated anything about how my mother was feeling or thinking, or her process in any way. But I still have them, and they're really special to me. But my mother was one of these people, when we would travel to Europe, she literally would plan every minute of every day. And so we would, like, her itineraries are on the inside of these little notebooks. And she'd be like, we're having breakfast here, and then we're going to go to this cathedral and that museum, and then we're going to have lunch here, and then we're going to go to this place and that place. And I just remember, as a kid, going on these trips where they were like whirlwinds, and we saw everything, that what there was to see. And I think in a weird way, I kind of travel that way too. I want to see.
You do travel
go to
that
this
way.
stuff. I want to see the stuff. My brother is different than that. My brother will go somewhere and he'll just like hang out on the beach, and I'm like, you can't hang out on the beach. There's museums to go to, and there's churches to see, and and so that's kind of the way I travel. But I learned that from Mom, from those notebooks.
I'm like,
Wait, I have to say, I traveled to Lisbon with Suzanne, and I have never walked so much in my whole life as those 3 days in Lisbon. My legs felt like two steel posts at the end of traveling with Suzanne. That is the truth. It was really fun though, and I saw a lot.
I've heard that from a lot of people that travel with me. They say I walk them to death.
Do you always travel like that, Suzanne?
I think I do, yes.
Oh.
I was trained by the best.
Well, you do see like 10 times as much. When I go with Pete, yeah, she was a good model for you.
Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts or comments or?
Well, I just can't wait to read your next book, and I was so thrilled with your last one.
Thank you, Diane. Appreciate that.
I look forward to reading your book, Suzanne.